Welcome to the Indian Cultural Forum. We have with us Madhavi Menon, who teaches English at Ashoka University, and she is going to talk about Infinite Variety, a history of desire in India, her latest book. So we have Yogesh with us from the Indian Cultural Forum. He's going to ask a few questions.
Hi, Madhavi.
Hi,
Uh,
Yogesh.
well, to begin with, the title of the book is Infinite Variety, a history of desire in India. What is very interesting while reading the book is the coming together of mythology and history. And now we are at a point in the country where there is a, de- a desire to make mythology history.
Right.
So my question to you is, why did you bring mythology and history together to talk about desire in India?
Right. I mean, I have lots to say about the title of my book, but I'll say one of the most important words in the title is actually the word a history of desire in India. Because too often when we think about history, we think about it with the definite article, which is the historical record or the historical archive. And it's when we fall prey to that idea that history exists only in one form or with one certainty that we start assuming that mythology and history become the same thing. Now, the problem with saying, the historical record, or this is how the history happened, is that it tends to write out multiple voices or the multiplicity of voices that exist at any historical moment, at any cultural moment, that there can actually never be the historical record. There always has to be multiplicity. And so when we're thinking about an idea like desire, which is never singular, which is never single, even though it can be single-minded, there is absolutely no way you can use the definite article. And so for me, the relationship was not so much between mythology and history, but that if you are writing a history with the implicit invitation that other people should write other histories, right? If you're not sort of saying this is the be-all and end-all, you're actually saying here's the door that can be opened wider and wider and in different directions. So for me, the relationship is not mythology and history so much as any moment in history or any account of history is populated by multiple things. Mythology is one of them. Literature is one of them. Sociology is one of them. Economics is one of them. Gender and sexuality, certainly. So there are all these components that we like to think of as being separated, but actually all are coexisting at the same time to produce what we call reality. And so if we're thinking about any kind of history, we have to think about this sort of hugely populated horizon rather than a truncated one. But to go back to your question, of course, the danger in what I'm saying is that this idea that history is multiple can also be used to subscribe to or support revisionist versions of history, right? To say, oh, actually, the Rajputs were always victorious, for instance, against the Mughals, which is, of course, what we're seeing now in the rewriting of history textbooks. But we have to remember that that attempt at rewriting history, which we might call mythological, certainly, is an attempt that still seeks to impose the definite article, right? This was the way in which things happened. Whereas if you're actually open to the idea that that this is what the official record said at that moment, here is this poem that suggests something else, you actually give people a more well-rounded picture rather than a narrower one. And so this idea of rewriting history sort of shrinks our horizons of possibility, whereas the idea of a history and therefore multiple histories, I hope, expands our horizon of possibilities.
Yeah. Also, the reason why I asked this question to dwell a bit deeper into the book itself is it's interesting how to see how a mythological character like Sita, who is supposed to be this Pativrata Nari, the epitome of what we call Pativrata, coexists with a Nair woman like you were talking about, right? So can you just talk about this existence of these two, what do you say, like radically
Ideas, these
different
two
ideas
ideas.
together
In the book,
in
you
the
mean?
book?
I mean, not side by side.
Not
It's
side
not,
by side. It's not. It's not.
Also, Madhvi, if I may, there is a sense in which the Indians, the way we look at history is said to be different. Where if you say that a certain god, say Ram, did not exist, and that he's a figure of mythology, then people get a little agitated. whereas it might not inform their everyday decisions. So also, why did you happen to select these two figures and not any other two?
I mean, that's a huge question, but that's great because it's a huge topic and a huge subject. I mean, the thing I guess we understand, but we don't necessarily always recognize, is that the category women and men are not monolithic. And so to say, why do you have two women like Sita and the matrilineal Nair women in the same book, gives us some sense of how that category of woman is actually not monolithic and can never be. Because, of course, there are all kinds of women and there are all kinds of men. And there are all kinds of women who don't think of themselves as women, and there are all kinds of men who don't think of themselves as men. And we have to recognize that the categories male and female are mere conveniences for us. And the minute we start thinking that convenience is truth is when we get into trouble. Whereas for me, I think I have never sort of allowed that collapse to take place. So when I use the word women or I use the word men, to my mind, I'm using it very much with the idea of the heterogeneity within those categories and across those categories. And this is why, of course, something like patriarchy can exist in the world, right? Because both men and women subscribe to it. So it's not about men being evil, even though that is largely the case, and women being victims, even though that is largely the case. There are active women subscribing to the notion of a patriarchal worldview. It's how any system of domination gets set up. If you think about colonialism, without the active enlisting of Indian agents to quell other Indians, the British would never have set up camp here the way they did. So the idea of women is heterodox. It is not, in fact, singular. And the same goes for the politics of men and women, right? If we did not have men who were feminists, we would be completely lost. Unfortunately, we have many, many women who are misogynists, and that is one of the reasons we are completely lost. So Sita, to me, to my mind, mythological character. What's interesting to me always about myths or texts like the Ramayana is the narratives that they tell and the narratives that catch hold or catch fire in the public imagination. As you well know, and this is why Ramanujan's essay was banned in Delhi University, depending on which part of the country you go to, you actually get a different version of the story. We are so embedded in a certain North Indian upper caste Hindu male version of events that we think this is all there is to it, which is actually not true. So, if you go to the south, if you go to the east, if you go to the northeast, you have different versions of the Ramayana. And depending on which version you look at, you have different valorizations as well. So you have, in fact, more agency in terms of desire given to Sita in certain other versions. Less so, perhaps, in the Valmiki version of Ramayana. So to me, it says a lot about the socio-cultural milieu in which we are living in Delhi or in North India that valorizes one version of the Ramayana in which you have a straight line of descent from Rama to our current Prime Minister, a sort of muscular, broad-chested version of masculinity, which has to have, absolutely has to have as its corollary, a submissive, victimized femininity. Right? There is, you can't have a man who is strong without needing to have a woman who is weak or makes him weak. I mean, that's the way narratives function. And so to my mind, it says much more about North India, that this is the kind of Sita and Rama we valorize, which is less so perhaps in different parts of the country. And so therefore, the other example that you picked up, of course, no prizes for guessing, comes from the south of the country, right? Where the attitude to gender, the attitude to masculinity and femininity is in some crucial ways different. Not in all ways, clearly, but is in some crucial ways different, only because there is the sense that you have an entire community, and certainly in terms of numbers, a huge community in Kerala, in which marriage, for instance, was historically not part of the deal because women controlled both the money and the name. And so then if we turn that light back onto the idea of marriage and say, well, so marriage is all about financial and lineage issues, then that should allow us to rethink the question, perhaps even revisit Sita and ask about her marriage, or go to, the heroine I prefer, which is Draupadi, and think about her 5 marriages, you know, which is really interesting. So there are as many women as there are people in the world, and it's just useful for us to remember that, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, on that note, on one hand, we have this whole debate of talking about Sita and Rama
Yeah.
as these characters who are necessary for Indians. I mean, like that's precisely what the current dispensation is trying to put across as. And on the other hand, there is also this other project of shunning away large part of Indian history, which is the Mughal history. The beautiful thing that you do in the book is to bring both Islamic traditions and Islamic cultures and Hindu mythology or so-called the Hindu history together as if there is no difference.
Yeah.
So was that a deliberate effort on your part?
Is desire any different if your religion changes, if your way of life or your culture changes? And
Yes and no to your question, and I think no to your question, the short answer. Now, here's the longer answer. Yes and no, in as much as, so this book came out in 2018, so I started writing it after the first, or the BJP government in 2014 had been elected. I had just moved back to the country, and I was very aware that the reasons for which I had moved back were, to my mind, under threat and under attack, and that has only become worse. So to my mind, yes, there is a way in which this absolutely and unquestionably syncretic fabric of Indian lived reality was something that I wanted to foreground, but not because I was making it up, but because I felt we were at a particular juncture in history where it needed to be foregrounded. So, you know, there is not a single person. I mean, even people say laughingly about the BJP need to sort of rename everything that sounds vaguely un-Hindu for them. And as someone pointed out, Amit Shah's name, the last name, Shah, is Iranian as well. You know, there is not a single person living in India today that has a single provenance or a single lineage or an uncomplicated, uncluttered history to wherever it is, or lineage to God. No matter how much they believe it themselves and like to convince others. So in some ways, this was the only way to write this book. To actually think about the various confluences or various points at which these cultures have come together. In fact, you know, what's interesting is a film like Jodha Akbar from many years ago. I mean, you know, there were problems with that film, but one thing I found that they did very interestingly was how they played with language. And so Jodha comes in speaking a very Sanskritized Hindi. Akbar comes in speaking a very Persianized Urdu. And through the course of the film, the language knits into what we call Hindustani today, which is what we speak.
Yeah.
All of us, right? We do not speak Doordarshan Hindi. We do not speak what gets spoken as Hindi on these airplanes. My God, if you fly Air India, they'll say Jai Hind if you want to go to the bathroom. You know, it's like every announcement is about this kind of Sanskritized, muscular version of the nation, which is actually so divorced from reality.
Right.
So I just...
Hindi as a sort of imposition on the various peoples who, you know, speak different languages.
Exactly. So one of the things I very much wanted to make clear is that this is not actually how we live. Which, you know, leads me, Pragya, to your question, which is that do we desire differently depending on where we come from and who we are? Now, on the one hand, clearly, different people have different desires. But what is interesting is that I don't think we can attribute a cause for it. So it's not because you come from here that you desire this way, or because your caste is this that you desire that way, because then the world would frankly be a much easier place to live in, right? Because you could control causality. Whereas causality, in fact, and desire cannot be controlled, which is why it is so frightening, right? Which is why all these sort of honor killings, because you're breaking boundaries of caste, or you're breaking boundaries of religion, or you're breaking rules of gender. And so desire is actually very frightening and very scary, which is why we really try and sort of clamp down on it. And which is why I'm fascinated, for instance, and I have a chapter on that in this book, on the question of the law. And, you know, it's what I might work on next as well, which is I really, and I feel bad for the law because it really tries to grapple with desire and fails every time. And there are better attempts and worse attempts, but there is absolutely nothing about desire that is obedient. And that for me is what is fascinating about it. So no, I don't think we desire differently if we are Hindus or Muslims. I think depending on where we come from, certain things are proscribed to us. So we are told not to desire X or not to desire Y. But unfortunately, or fortunately from my lens, that actually can't control how we desire.
You mean that, where you stand and how you desire, is it completely driven by the individual?
No, all I'm saying is that how we desire does not necessarily stem from where we stand. So for instance, we can be really committed feminists, for instance, committed women who are feminists, and we might be attracted to men who are really sleazy. Because there is a way in which, as sort of one of my mentors always likes to say, desire is not politically correct. That's what makes it dangerous. It's what makes it dangerous for us. I mean, I think individuals can often be shocked by what they desire. So an upper caste Hindu, for instance, who's always been taught never to share dishes or food or anything of the kind, might really be attracted to, only to, lower caste laborers. What do you do with that? Where does that come from, right? And so that kind of inability to sort of say, oh, this is the lineage, right? I'm sort of quite anti-lineage on all fronts. And desire for me is fascinating because it doesn't really have a lineage. Of course, people can be very obedient and obey their parents' wishes and have a good arranged marriage where your caste and class and everything is matched up. But that is not necessarily their desire. And this is the thing about marriage, is that it's not an index of one's desire necessarily at all. Which is why people make such a tamasha out of it, because they know that too. But they think, okay, if we invite 1,000 people, then we'll be too ashamed to do anything about it, So, so it's very interesting. It's not like people don't know this. I think we all do. But then we take steps actively or otherwise to pretend that that's not the case.